Over the past few months, the European bourgeois media have ignited a debate, forecasting a surge in electoral success for nationalist and even fascist groups in the upcoming elections. Consequently, various bourgeois social democratic parties in EU nations, such as Germany, are rallying for support of pro-European and progressive policies in the forthcoming European elections to counter the ascent of the far right and fascism. Their hypocrisy is glaring. It is their backing that has led to the demolition of anti-fascist monuments and the erection of memorials glorifying the Nazi Waffen-SS in several European countries, like the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Ukraine. Communist parties and symbols have been banned, and history has been rewritten to suit the interests of capitalists, who have historically been the primary sponsors of fascism worldwide. Furthermore, for years, the Council of Europe, the EU, and the European Parliament have disseminated anti-communist rhetoric through a series of resolutions aiming to equate communism with fascism, a move that effectively exonerates fascism. The EU even attempted to replace the commemoration of the day of the anti-fascist victory of the peoples on May 9th with Europe Day. Moreover, amidst the ongoing imperialist war in Ukraine, certain factions invoke the anti-fascist struggle and policies of the anti-fascist fronts from the 7th Congress of the Comintern to obscure the true causes of the war from the public eye. This occurs while the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion, portrayed by EU leaders as defenders of freedom and democracy, battles in Ukraine. Concurrently, neo-Nazi groups like Rusits and the Russian Imperial Legion are heralded as guardians of the values of the Russian world as they fight for Russia. Given the aforementioned points, the topic under discussion today holds significant relevance. The European Communist Action event offers us the opportunity to emphasize some conclusions deemed beneficial by the KKE, drawn from historical analysis, and to present recent experiences and assessments of the fight against fascism. The anniversary celebrated on May 9th, marking 79 years since the end of the Second World War, is not to be dubbed European Union Day, as representatives within the reactionary EU establishment have attempted to assert in recent years. Rather, it stands as the day of the great anti-fascist victory of the peoples, a testament to the valor of the Soviet Red Army and the people alongside the resistance movements of Europe, with particular acknowledgement of the pivotal and guiding role played by communist parties. Communists honor all those who took up arms, sacrificed, endured torture, imprisonment, and exile, and fought valiantly against the Nazi fascist imperialist axis comprised of Germany, Italy, Japan, and their collaborators. The KKE takes pride in having been the driving force, the lifeblood, and the guiding light of the heroic struggle of the National Liberation Front, the Greek People's Liberation Army, the United Panhellenic Organization of Youth, and other EAM-derived organizations. Additionally, the thousands of KKE members who, through their heroic actions and sacrifice, etched some of the most illustrious pages in its history and contributed to the victorious outcome of the war, deserve recognition.
Heroes, Abatahuna, Heroes, Malpecasoes, Castra tu Olimpo, que tu guarda su fantasmata, heroes fantasmata. Castra tua y mujer para su fantasmata, heroes fantasmata. Guarda, continuero, mata para mi vuelo. Pirstina la mano che pocciasto gorgo potamo, che pocciasto gorgo potamo. Pirstina la mano che pocciasto gorgo potamo, che pocciasto gorgo potamo.
While acknowledging the Soviet Union and partisan movements for their fight against fascism, it is imperative to recognize that the Second World War, like its predecessor, was an imperialist war. It epitomized the zenith of imperialist rivalries for the redistribution of markets and spheres of influence, exacerbated amidst capitalist crises. When contradictions between monopolies reach an impasse over profitability and cannot be resolved through fragile compromises within the framework of an imperialist peace, they resort to war. The underlying cause of the First and Second World Wars, as well as subsequent conflicts extending to contemporary times in regions such as Ukraine and the Middle East, remains rooted in capitalist relations of production, the capitalist system in its imperialist phase. Within this context, bourgeois classes exploit nationalist and even fascist forces in their strategies for war, exemplified by those in Ukraine who harbor nostalgia for Bandera and the Azov battalions, or advocates of the fascist philosopher Ivan Ilin's higher political school, recently established within the prominent state university in the Russian capital. The Second World War can be considered a just war only from the USSR's perspective, who fought to defend workers' socialist power and support resistant movements combating fascist occupation for the survival and well-being of their people. For Britain, the USA, and other powers, the wars was unjust and imperialist. They bore responsibility for the rise of fascism in Germany and aimed to preserve and expand their roles in the imperialist system secured through their victory in the First World War. Similarly, for the fascist Axis, the war was imperialist and unjust, seeking to alter the established balance of power after the First World War. Both sides pursued their profits and geopolitical interests. Both are guilty of grave crimes against humanity. While the fascist Axis perpetrated mass executions and purges, the USA and Britain also committed atrocities, such as the bombing of Dresden and the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not out of military necessity, but to intimidate the USSR and assert their post-war political agenda. It is imperative for the international communist movement to fully comprehend that the war was unjust for all participating bourgeois powers. This understanding is especially crucial today, as various bourgeois powers adopt the guise of anti-fascism to conceal their true predatory motives in the ongoing imperialist war. In this contemporary arena, where the Euro-Atlantic imperialist axis, comprising the USA, NATO, and the EU, clashes with the emerging Eurasian imperialist axis led by China, Russia, and their allies, the Ukrainian bourgeoisie, historically aligned with Nazi collaborators, serves as the frontline force. Fascism represents a distinct political manifestation of capitalist power. In the aftermath of the First World War, and spurred by the influence of the triumphant October Socialist Revolution, the German and Italian bourgeoisie found themselves confronted by a burgeoning communist and workers' people's movement. This movement posed a direct challenge to their power, exemplified by the 1918-1919 revolution in Germany and the mass factory occupations of the Italian North during the Biennio Rosso, Red Biennium, of the 1918-1920. Simultaneously, the German bourgeoisie, having suffered significant losses in the previous war, and the Italian bourgeoisie, feeling aggrieved by the post-war distribution of imperialist spoils, despite their victory, sought to aggressively alter the existing balance of power. In response, fascism and Nazism emerged as their chosen tools to quash domestic class opposition and to wage war against other capitalist states abroad. The defining characteristic of the fascist form of capitalist power lies in its active and widespread mobilization of societal forces in support of reactionary capitalist agendas. This mobilization was deemed unnecessary for the victors of the previous war, who, owing to imperialist superprofits, could secure the compliance of workers' people's forces through alliances with middle strata and concessions to the labor aristocracy. Beyond this, there are no fundamental distinctions. The specifics of fascism and Nazism cannot be solely attributed to the suspension of parliamentary processes, a trait common to all bourgeois dictatorial regimes. It is worth noting that both fascism and Nazism emerged from bourgeois parliamentary systems. Nor is the essence of fascism Nazism solely defined by unprecedented repression of workers, peoples, and communist movements. As such repression is prevalent not only in bourgeois dictatorships, but also in parliamentary systems. Throughout its 105-year history, the KKE has faced severe prosecution from bourgeois regimes ranging from dictatorial to parliamentary forms of governance. For instance, the dictatorial Metaxas regime in Greece in 1939 established the so-called Provisional Administration of the KKE, composed of informers aiming to undermine the Communist Party of Greece. Today, under the guise of socialism of the 21st century, Social Democrat Maduro targets the Communist Party of Venezuela, constructing a counterfeit PCV, Communist Party of Venezuela, recognized by the bourgeois state. Furthermore, exploitation of other peoples is not unique to fascism and Nazism, as the parliamentary traditions of France and England were intertwined with colonialism. Even racialism, characteristic of Nazism but not necessarily fascism, is not exclusive to fascist and Nazi regimes. The ideology of civilizing inferior races served as the ideological justification for colonialism. Post war, numerous capitalist member states of the European Union, notably Great Britain, maintained close ties with the apartheid regime in South Africa. The shared attributes of fascism with other political forms underscore that the anti-fascist struggle remains incomplete unless it is directed towards the overthrow of capitalist power. The Seventh Congress of the Communist International endorsed the strategy of the anti-fascist People's Fronts, with both before and after World War II pursued governance within the framework of capitalism. Initially, this approach served as a defense mechanism against the rise of fascism, and later as a transitional phase towards workers' power. Prior to the war, communist parties utilized fronts to seek collaboration with social democratic and even bourgeois democratic forces. Their objective was to isolate fascist bourgeois forces and thwart their ascension to power in each respective country. However, during this period, many communist parties focused solely on combating fascist forces, refraining from challenging bourgeois powers and capitalist states participating in worker exploitation and warfare. Consequently, they instilled in the consciousness of workers and the populace the notion of those powers and states being anti-fascist. Furthermore, amid the war, communist parties pursued post-war cooperation, including governmental alliances with these same forces. As a result, they failed to connect the armed anti-fascist liberation struggle with a quest for workers' power. A poignant illustration of this is our country, Greece, liberated from Nazi occupation 80 years ago. This liberation was primarily attributable to the remarkable victories of the Red Army, coupled with the indispensable contributions of the armed resistance, anti-fascist, and liberation movements alongside their affiliated organizations like the National Liberation Front and the Greek People's Liberation Army, all initiated by the KKE. During the resounding success of this mass and armed resistance movement, Greece found itself in a revolutionary setting in October 1944. It was during this period that bourgeois powers was significantly destabilized amid a widespread economic and political crisis underscored by the faltering operation of repression mechanisms and governance institutions controlled by the bourgeoisie. However, despite these conducive conditions for revolutionary change, the workers' people's movement failed to secure victory. This failure stemmed from our party's inability to elevate the armed liberation and anti-fascist struggle into a conscious and strategic path towards socialist revolution. Instead, we adhere to the notion of national unity and the formation of an anti-fascist government. This stance inadvertently provided the bourgeoisie, which had reconciled its internal conflicts between pro-British and pro-German factions out of fear of losing power, along with its Anglo-American allies, the opportunity to launch a comprehensive political military offensive against the KKE and the working class movement. In the wake of this assault, the so-called bourgeois democratic forces unhesitatingly utilized former Nazi collaborators to thwart the heroic efforts of the Democratic Army of Greece. Regrettably, even in European countries where communist parties participated in post-war coalition governments through the anti-fascist fronts, this did not signify a significant step towards the transition to workers' power. Instead, it served to ensure the compliance of leading workers' people's forces until capitalist hegemony was fully established, ultimately resulting in the expulsion of communist parties from all government positions. Understanding why the bourgeois system across Europe, and sometimes even beyond, turns to nationalist, racist, and fascist crutches to bolster its position is crucial. This trend is undeniable, as evidenced by the financial backing provided to such forces by segments of capital, the utilization of repressive mechanisms like the police and armed forces, and the portrayal of these forces as purportedly anti-system by major bourgeois media outlets. It becomes apparent that such forces are exploited by each bourgeoisie both as enforcers of the system and as avant-garde against the workers' people's movement. The notion, circulating within the international communist movement, that fascism is exported by the USA, often labeled as a fascist or pro-fascist power, is entirely baseless and erroneous. Furthermore, the KKE, drawing insights from the history of the Comintern, has concluded that the pre-Second World War division of states within the international imperialist system into fascist pro-war and democratic pro-peace factions, which prevailed within the Comintern, was misguided and detrimental. Today, certain factions within the international communist movement are reverting to this flawed division, which obfuscates both the class character of bourgeois regimes and the root causes of the emergence and fortification of fascist forces. These root causes lie within monopoly capitalism itself and its service to capitalist interests within each country. The KKE has gleaned lessons from history and rejects the notion of categorizing imperialist forces into bad, fascist, neo-fascist, and good ones. Likewise, it disagrees with calls to form anti-fascist fronts devoid of class criteria, advocating for alliances with all progressive and honest people, as some suggest. Such approaches and calls only serve to disarm the communist movement and the working class, leading them to relinquish their historical mission and promoting a narrative of purifying imperialism by targeting fascist forces. Simultaneously, they provide a justification for so-called democratic and pro-peace bourgeois forces. To justify the aforementioned distorted perspective, there is widespread speculation regarding Georgy Dimitrov's definition of fascism at the Seventh Comintern Congress as the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, the most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. We believe that the Seventh Congress drew a clear distinction between the power of finance capital and the interests of industrial capital, as well as between fascist and democratic capitalist states. Consequently, the alliance between the workers and communist movements with certain bourgeois powers and states was elevated into an ideology, weakening the working class readiness against the opposing class, as observed previously. Today, some selectively reference Dimitrov's definition of fascism while disregarding the fact that the Communist International had previously provided another definition in its program in 1928. This definition acknowledged, amongst other items, that, under certain special historical conditions, the progress of this bourgeois imperialist reactionary offensive assumes the form of fascism. Moreover, the features of fascism were elaborated in detail in the resolution on the international situation at the Sixth Congress of the Communist International in 1928. It's also overlooked that Dimitrov's well-known definition in 1935 was formulated under different historical circumstances, when imperialist powers were plotting the dissolution of the only socialist state in the world, the USSR, while the USSR itself was endeavoring to exploit contradictions among the imperialist powers and create a rift between them. This definition is therefore divorced from the historical conditions that gave rise to it, and is mechanistically and unscientifically applied to present conditions where the USSR no longer exists and the situation in China does not align with socialist principles. China is now a capitalist superpower competing with the USA for supremacy in the international imperialist system. Throughout history and continuing into the present, fascist forms have emerged and developed not only due to right-wing forces, but also due to the influence of social democracy. These forces promote the unhistorical theory of the two extremes, falsely equating communism with fascism. In doing so, they seek to absolve capitalism of the crimes of fascism and Nazism while unfairly attributing them to the communist movement, the only force that has consistently and selflessly fought against them. Furthermore, the disillusionment of people's forces with low political standards, coupled with the unfulfilled promises of right-wing and social democratic parties in government, alongside the weakened presence of communist parties and significant worker struggles, fuels the political resurgence of nationalist, racist, and even fascist elements. This trend becomes particularly pronounced amid extensive destruction of lower and middle strata during capitalist crises, exacerbated by rising poverty, unemployment, and the erosion of support for bourgeois parliamentary parties. It is during such times that the bourgeoisie strategically leverages fascist parties as vanguards to advance its interests. Exploiting extreme nationalism and purported solidarity, these fascist entities attempt to ensnare people's forces, the unemployed, and the economically distressed petty bourgeois strata. In contemporary times, the path to fascist forces and their legitimization is also facilitated by opportunist communist factions. These groups, under the guise of restoring national sovereignty, threatened by the EU, as seen in Italy, or rejecting USA export of fascism, as observed in Russia, engage in dialogue or collaboration with inherently fascist-leaning entities. Over the past decades, the KKE has confronted various fascist entities exploiting criminalistic nationalist, national socialist ideologies to justify their violent acts against immigrants, trade unionists, communists, and others. A prominent example is the fascist group Golden Dawn, which sought to revive Nazi assault squad tactics and blend them with political action. This group maintained connections with leading members and nationalist far-right groups following the fall of the military dictatorship in the 1970s, cultivating vulgar anti-communism, racism, and hatred towards the labor movement. They formed strong relationships within the army, police, and secret services, and perpetrated violent attacks. Operating more systematically since the 1980s, the Golden Dawn intensified its attacks and bullying, for example, on immigrants and students. The deep capitalist economic crisis of 2008-2009 brought the Golden Dawn to the forefront. Public discontent with successive anti-popular measures brought a political restructuring of the bourgeois system, evident in the status of the social democratic parties with the rise of Syriza and the decline of PASOK, and in the status of the far-right parties. The Nazi Golden Dawn capitalized on the fallout of the crisis to appeal to middle strata hit hard by economic downturns, as well as to a segment of the working class struggling with poverty and lacking ties to organized labor or trade unions. However, its ascent from the fringes to the forefront of politics wouldn't have been possible without backing from influential factions of the bourgeoisie and state apparatus. Marketed to the public as an anti-establishment force, supposedly combating social ills and advocating for the people's interests, the Golden Dawn benefited from reactionary sentiments that emerged during demonstrations like the ones organized by the indigents, which were heavily promoted by bourgeois media outlets. These sentiments called for the ousting of political parties and unions, effectively providing ideological cover for the Golden Dawn. In this way, the bourgeois system exploited the Golden Dawn to divert attention from organized class struggle and to advance bourgeois interests at the expense of workers, advocating against strikes, advocating for further wage cuts, contract abolitions, and more, all to appease ship owners, for instance, so that they would construct their ships in Greece. Representatives of the Golden Dawn easily got a seat at the bourgeois media panels and formed a parliamentary group. Through violent assaults on trade unionists, KKE members, and immigrant populations, the Golden Dawn aimed to establish itself as the iron fist of the bourgeois system. During this period, the Golden Dawn maintained connections with other bourgeois parties and local actors. The KKE, however, exposed and marginalized the Golden Dawn, along with other fascist entities, from trade union movements and political activities. Meanwhile, other bourgeois parties maintained a seemingly civilized stance towards them. For instance, the communist mayor of Patras refused to provide space for the pre-election propaganda of the Nazi Golden Dawn. Though prosecuted, the mayor was acquitted thanks to the popular solidarity. Communists also actively prevented Golden Dawn representatives from participating in public events. The murder of the anti-fascist musician Pavlos Fyssas and the murderous attacks against immigrants and communist trade unionists sparked widespread resistance, temporarily halting the Golden Dawn's influence and leading to the incarceration of its leadership. Notably, under the watch of all bourgeois governments, including the leftist Syriza, it took 7 years from the arrest of the Golden Dawn killers to their trial and conviction. The resolute struggle of the people, with the communists leading the charge, played a pivotal role in securing the conviction of the Nazi criminals. Throughout the trial of the Golden Dawn, the KKE and the lawyers representing communist unionists underscored the organization's Nazi affiliation and its complicity with the establishment. They emphasized that the Golden Dawn's criminal activities stemmed directly from its abhorrent Nazi ideology. However, we remain acutely aware that as long as the capitalist system persists, the very cradle of such abominations, our battle against fascism is far from over. As Dimitris Koutsoupas, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the KKE, aptly stated, "The paramount objective is for the people to eradicate this evil at its core, by dismantling the system that nurtures the seed of the serpent, Nazism, fascism." The KKE has firmly established that the fight against fascism aimed at defending workers' rights and the accomplishments of the people is inherently linked to the battle against monopolies, capitalist exploitation, and their dominance. The Communist Party must steadfastly avoid forming alliances with bourgeois and opportunist factions under the guise of shallow anti-fascism. To echo Brecht's poignant words, those who are against fascism without being against capitalism, who lament over the barbarism that comes out of barbarism, are like people who wish to eat their veal without slaughtering the cow. They are willing to eat the calf, but they dislike the sight of blood. They are easily satisfied if the butcher washes his hands before weighing the meat. They're not against the property relations with the engender barbarism. They're only against barbarism itself. They raise their voices against barbarism, and they do so in countries where precisely the same property relations prevail, but where the butchers wash their hands before weighing the meat. Therefore, the Communist Party's dedication to achieving workers' power and uniting the forces of the social alliance of the working class and other urban and rural popular strata in an anti-monopoly, anti-capitalist struggle must remain resolute. This approach strengthens the opposition of workers and people against bourgeois power and advances the prospect of a people's struggle to dismantle capitalist tyranny and construct a new socialist communist society. Especially in the current context, marked by escalating inter-imperialist rivalries and global unrest fueled by the division of natural resources, labor power, trade routes, market dominance, and geopolitical influence, we must stand firmly against both false anti-fascism and the capitalist system that spawns fascism and war. It is imperative for the people to rise up, to take the streets in protest, with communists leading the charge. In the European elections, it is crucial to convey an anti-war, anti-imperialist message opposing the warmongering EU by endorsing communist parties.